I never imagined that a single sentence could divide my life into before and after. I was standing by the window that afternoon, watching dust settle on the old curtains, when my son said it. Calmly, almost politely. "Don't expect me to take care of you in old age. I have my own life and my own family." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. I waited for laughter, for an apology, for some sign that he had spoken without thinking. But nothing followed. He looked at his phone, already elsewhere, already free of me. I nodded. That was all I could manage. Years of words rose in my throat. About nights without sleep. About meals skipped so he could have more. About shoes I didn't buy for myself so he could have better ones. None of it mattered in that moment. I realized something terrible and simple. I had raised a man who saw me as a chapter already closed. After he left, the house felt larger, emptier. The silence was not new, but it had never been this heavy. I sat at the kitchen table and traced the cracks in the wood with my finger, remembering how small his hands once were, how tightly they used to hold mine. I did not cry right away. Tears came later, quietly, like visitors who didn't want to disturb anyone. What came first was clarity, cold, sharp, and honest. If I was alone now, then I had been alone for a long time. I had simply refused to see it. That evening I took out a folder from the drawer. Papers I hadn't touched in years. I stared at them for a long time, understanding that love cannot be demanded, but dignity can be chosen. And for the first time in my life I chose myself. That night sleep avoided me like a stranger. I lay in bed listening to the clock mark time, each second sounding louder than the last. The house creaked the way old bodies do, reminding me that nothing here was young anymore. Not the walls, not me, not the memories trapped inside. I replayed his words again and again, searching for a softer meaning. Maybe he was tired. Maybe someone had put those thoughts into his head. But deep down I knew the truth hurts most when it is simple. He meant exactly what he said. In the early hours I got up and made tea. The cup shook slightly in my hands. I remembered how, years ago, I used to wake before dawn to pack his lunches, iron his shirts, warm his coat by the heater in winter. I never asked whether he would do the same for me one day. I assumed love worked like an echo, that it returned. But echoes fade. By morning my sadness had turned into something heavier. Understanding. I was no longer angry. Anger needs hope to survive. What I felt instead was resignation, calm and final. I opened the drawer again. The folder waited patiently, as if it had always known this day would come. Inside were documents about my small home, my savings, the few things I owned after a lifetime of careful living. I had written his name there once, proudly, without conditions. My hand hovered over the papers. I thought about the way he spoke of his family, not including me but placing me outside like furniture that no longer fit the room. "I have my own life," he had said. So did I. I was simply late realizing it. I didn't make any decisions that morning. Not yet. I needed time to separate love from illusion. But one thing was clear. I would never again beg for a place in someone's future. If I was to grow old, I would do it with dignity, even if I had to stand alone. Days passed, slow and quiet, as if the world had agreed to give me space. I moved through the house carefully, noticing things I had ignored for years. A chipped plate, a loose floorboard, the faded mark on the wall where his height had once been measured. Proof that time had moved on, even when I refused to. Neighbors asked about him. "Your son hasn't visited lately," they said kindly. I smiled and answered with practice phrases. "He's busy. He has a family." I didn't say what those words really meant. Some truths are too heavy to hand to strangers. One afternoon, I sat in the armchair by the window and allowed myself to remember honestly. Not just the happy moments but everything. The arguments I apologized for even when I wasn't wrong. The money I gave without asking why he needed it. The silence I accepted when calls stopped coming. Love I had believed was endurance. Now I wondered if endurance had slowly taught him that I would always be there, no matter how little he gave in return. That thought hurt more than his words. I took the folder out again and began to read line by line. Legal language is cold, but it is fair. It doesn't lie to protect feelings. It doesn't promise what it can't guarantee. For the first time, I appreciated its honesty. I imagined a future where I was ill, weak, dependent, and alone. Not because I had no child, but because I had one who chose not to see me. The image was not dramatic. It was realistic. And that frightened me more than death itself. I realized then that hope, when unreturned, becomes a kind of self-betrayal. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the drawer. My decision was forming slowly but firmly, like ice on a quiet river. I didn't hate my son. I still loved him. But love no longer meant sacrifice without limits. If he had chosen his life without me, then I would choose a future that did not depend on his mercy. And once that choice was made, there was no turning back. The appointment was set for a gray morning, the kind that makes everything feel honest. I dressed carefully, choosing a coat I hadn't worn in years. Not because it was special, but because it reminded me that I still had choices. Small ones maybe, but they were mine. The office smelled of paper and ink. The man across the desk spoke gently, explaining things I already understood. I listened, nodded, asked questions. My voice did not shake. I surprised myself with that. There is a strange strength that comes when you finally stop pretending. As he slid the documents toward me, my thoughts drifted. Not to my son's face, but to my own hands. Hands that had washed clothes, wiped tears, cooked meals, signed school forms. Hands that had given and given, without ever asking what would remain. Now they held a pen. I hesitated for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of mourning. You don't rewrite a will without also rewriting a story you once believed in. I signed slowly, deliberately, feeling something close inside me. Not love, but expectation. When I left the office, the air felt colder, sharper. Yet I breathed easier. For the first time, my future was no longer a question mark shaped like a person who had already answered me. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. Some decisions don't need witnesses. They only need truth. That evening, I sat alone with a bowl of soup growing cold in front of me. I imagined his reaction if he ever found out. Anger, surely. Confusion. Accusations. I wondered if guilt would appear among them. I wasn't certain. What I did know was this. If love only appears when something is taken away, then it was never love to begin with. I cleaned the kitchen, turned off the lights, and went to bed earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. I had drawn a line, not to punish but to protect myself. And lines once crossed change everything. I thought I had more time. For a few weeks nothing changed. No calls, no visits. The world stayed politely distant, as if respecting a boundary it didn't know existed. I settled into a routine, slow mornings, careful steps, conversations with myself that felt more honest than most I'd had in years. Then one afternoon the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first instinct was not fear but surprise. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, something in my chest tightened, not with joy but with recognition. This moment had been waiting for me. He didn't greet me. He stepped inside as if the house still belonged to him in some invisible way. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the room, counting what could be counted. The silence between us grew sharp. "You changed the will," he said. It wasn't a question. I looked at him and noticed details I hadn't before. The impatience in his posture, the way his jaw was set, not worried but offended. Not once did he ask how I was. Not once did he sit down. "Yes," I answered. The word fell gently, but it hit him hard. He laughed, short and bitter. "After everything I did for you," he said. And that was when I understood something painful and clear. In his mind, love had become a transaction. Care was a future promise he never intended to keep, but expected to be rewarded for anyway. My heart ached, but my voice stayed calm. "You were honest with me," I said. "I decided to be honest with myself." His face changed then. Anger rose quickly, filling the space where concern should have been. He spoke louder, faster, as if volume could rewrite reality. I stood still, listening, realizing that the son I mourned was not the one standing in my living room, but the child I lost years ago, quietly, without noticing. And as he spoke, I knew this confrontation was only the beginning. He walked through the room as if he were inspecting something that no longer belonged to him. His steps were restless, his eyes sharp. It was clear he hadn't come to see me. He had come to measure what he might lose. "You're selfish," he said suddenly. "After everything I did for you." The word everything echoed in my mind. I tried to remember what it meant to him. Missed visits? Broken promises? Long silences that I had learned not to question. I looked at his face, searching for even a trace of shame, but there was none. I raised you, I said quietly. That was everything. He shrugged. That's your job. Parents don't get paid back. Something inside me went still. Not anger. Not sadness. Just clarity. I understood then that gratitude had never lived in his heart. Only expectation. I sat down, feeling suddenly tired. He stayed standing, impatient, as if time itself owed him something. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. You can't cut me out. I'm your son. I met his eyes. I didn't cut you out, I said. You chose your distance long ago. For a moment he was silent. Then his mouth tightened. You'll regret this, he said. When you're old and alone. I almost smiled. That future had already begun. I had learned to live inside it quietly, without his help. I am already old, I replied. And I am already alone. He turned toward the door, anger wrapped in pride. Don't expect me to come back, he said. The door closed behind him. The silence returned, but this time it didn't hurt. It simply told the truth. After he left, I remained seated for a long time, listening to the echo of the door in my thoughts. Silence settled slowly, like dust after a storm. I didn't rush to clean it away. I let it be. Some messes are meant to be seen. That evening I noticed how tired my body felt. Not from the argument, but from years of carrying hope that had grown heavier with time. I made myself a simple meal and ate it standing by the counter, realizing how often I had done that when he was younger, saving the table for him, for his comfort, for his return. I washed the dishes carefully, as if each plate deserved respect. When you live alone, objects become witnesses. They remember how you treat yourself. The next day my hands ached. My back reminded me of its limits. Aging is not dramatic. It is persistent. I thought of his words again, the threat of abandonment he believed would break me. He never understood that abandonment is hardest when it happens slowly over years, not in one loud moment. I began to plan small things. Not for inheritance or legacy, but for survival. Doctor appointments. Groceries delivered instead of carried. A list of phone numbers pinned to the wall. Not his among them. This was not bitterness. It was adjustment. In the afternoon, sunlight filled the room, touching the chair where he had stood so angrily. The light didn't judge. It didn't take sides. It simply existed, offering warmth without asking anything back. I sat in that light and allowed myself to grieve, not for the man he had become, but for the boy he once was. The one who needed me. The one I loved without conditions. That boy was gone, and loving him no longer required me to suffer. As evening came, I felt something unfamiliar but steady. Resolve. If my life was to be quiet, it would also be intentional. If I was to be alone, I would not be powerless. I closed the curtains and whispered into the empty room, not in anger, but in acceptance. I will be fine. The days that followed were strangely calm. No calls. No apologies. No sudden concern. Part of me had expected a message, even an angry one, but none came. The silence confirmed what words already had. His visit was not about reconciliation. It was about control. I began to notice how much of my life had been shaped around waiting. Waiting for footsteps. Waiting for holidays. Waiting for a call that often never came. Letting go of that habit felt like learning to breathe differently. One morning I sorted through old boxes in the closet. Letters, photographs, school drawings kept long past their meaning. I sat on the floor and looked at a picture of him as a child, smiling without suspicion, trusting without fear. I held it for a while, then placed it back gently. Love does not disappear just because it hurts. What did disappear was illusion. I started speaking more, to neighbors, to the cashier at the store, even to myself. My voice sounded quieter than before, but also steadier. I was no longer rehearsing conversations that would never happen. That afternoon, I felt a sharp pain in my knee and had to sit down. Passed, but it reminded me of something important. Independence does not mean pretending you are strong. It means preparing for weakness without shame. I wrote things down. Instructions. Contacts. Simple plans for simple days. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the life I still had. As evening came, I stood by the window again. The same one where his words had changed everything. The view hadn't changed. The street was the same. But I was not. I no longer waited for someone to choose me. I had already chosen myself. A week later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. His handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, hurried, impatient even on paper. I stood there longer than necessary, holding it without opening, as if the weight of it might change if I waited. Inside was not an apology. It was a warning. He wrote about rights, about family, about what I owed him. The words were arranged carefully, almost legally, as if emotion could be replaced with entitlement. He reminded me of his childhood, of the roof I gave him, as though those years were an investment he now expected to collect with interest. I read the letter twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to accept what it was. This was not a son reaching out. This was a man negotiating. I folded the paper and placed it back in the envelope. My hands were steady. That surprised me most of all. Later that day, I went for a short walk. The air was cold, my steps slow. But the movement felt necessary. I watched other families pass by. Grown children helping parents, laughing, arguing softly. I didn't envy them. Envy assumes something was taken from you. I simply acknowledged that my story was different. At home, I sat at the table and wrote a response. Only a few lines. No accusations. No explanations. Just truth. I respect your life and your choices. Please respect mine. I did not mention love. Love had already been misunderstood too many times. When I sealed the envelope, I felt a quiet finality. Some doors close loudly. Others close with dignity. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because things were resolved, but because I had stopped trying to be understood by someone who no longer wished to see me. Peace, I was learning, does not require agreement. It only requires boundaries. After I sent the letter, I waited. Not with hope, but with awareness. There is a difference. Hope leans forward. Awareness stands still. Days passed without response. Then weeks. I told myself this was for the best, yet my body reacted before my mind could agree. I startled at sudden sounds. I checked the door twice before going to bed. Old instincts don't disappear just because you understand them. One morning, I noticed scratches near the lock. Small, almost invisible. They could have been there for years. Or they could have been new. I stood there longer than necessary, my hand resting on the cold metal, listening to my own breathing. That was when fear crept in, not dramatic, not loud. Practical fear. I spoke to a neighbor I trusted. Then another. I wrote down times, dates, details. It felt strange, documenting my own life as if preparing to defend it. Yet there was comfort in order. Control doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from preparation. At night, memories returned uninvited. His childhood illness. The way I sat beside his bed counting breaths. How fiercely I had protected him from the world. I wondered when protection had turned into permission. I didn't blame myself anymore. Blame is a luxury of those who still believe they can fix the past. Instead, I began to imagine a future that did not include sudden visits or raised voices. A future where my door opened only for those who came with respect. That thought felt fragile but real. One evening, as I was turning off the lights, a car slowed outside my house. Too slowly. It stopped, then moved on. I stood in the darkness, heart pounding, realizing something important. Changing a will does not only change paper, changes people. And not all reactions come wrapped in words. The next morning, I awoke with a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with sleep. Fear leaves traces, even when nothing happens. I moved carefully through the house, checking windows, listening for sounds that weren't there. I told myself I was being sensible, not paranoid. Age teaches you the value of caution. I decided to change my routine. Different hours. Shorter walks. I kept the curtains half closed during the day. It wasn't how I wanted to live, but it was how I needed to live for now. Independence sometimes means adaptation, not stubbornness. In the afternoon, the phone rang. My heart jumped before my mind could stop it. When I answered, it was not him. Just a service call, a wrong number. A reminder of how easily fear attaches itself to expectation. I sat down and laughed quietly at myself. Not because it was funny, but because laughter was better than letting fear win. I had survived worse things than this. I had survived disappointment, neglect, years of emotional absence. I would survive uncertainty too. I took out an old notebook and began to write. Not letters, not plans, but memories. Small ones. Honest ones. The truth as I saw it, not as it would be judged. If someone ever read it, I wanted them to know I had loved deeply and lived carefully. As evening approached, a knock came at the door. My body froze. For a moment I considered not answering. Then I remembered who this house belonged to. When I opened the door, it was only a delivery. Groceries I had ordered earlier. I thanked the young man and closed the door, feeling both foolish and relieved. I leaned against the wall and breathed slowly. This was my home. My life. My time. And whoever chose to enter it would have to come without threats, without demands, and without reminding me of debts I had already paid in full. That night I dreamed of my house as it once was. Full, noisy, careless. Doors left open. Shoes by the entrance. Laughter spilling into rooms that now held only echoes. I woke before dawn with tears on my pillow, and no clear memory of what had hurt most. I made coffee and sat at the table, letting the warmth steady me. Dreams have a way of reopening doors you've locked for good reasons. I reminded myself that nostalgia is not an invitation. It is only a memory asking to be acknowledged. Later that morning I visited the doctor. Nothing serious, he said. Just age, stress, tension. Words that sound harmless until they settle into your bones. As I left the clinic, I realized how alone I truly was in moments like these. No hand to hold. No one to call first. And yet I walked home on my own. That thought stayed with me. Loneliness had not stopped me from living. It had simply forced me to live differently. In the afternoon, I sorted my papers again. Not the will this time, but old receipts, guarantees, instructions. I labeled folders clearly. I wanted order not because I expected the end, but because I respected continuity. Someone someday would need clarity, even if that someone was me. A message arrived on my phone that evening. From him. One sentence. We need to talk. No greeting. No concern. Just need. I stared at the screen for a long time. My heart reacted before my mind could intervene. Then calm returned, slow but firm. Need was not the same as care. I placed the phone face down and did not reply. Not yet. Silence can be an answer when words would only reopen wounds. As night fell, I turned off the lights one by one, moving through my home with intention. Whatever conversation waited ahead, I would not enter it afraid. I had already survived his absence. I would survive his return too. I did not answer his message that night. I slept on it, letting my thoughts settle like snow after wind. By morning my decision was clear, not because I was brave but because I was tired of reacting. I replied with a single line. If you want to talk, it will be here. Tomorrow. Afternoon. No explanations. No softness. Boundaries sound cold only to those who never respected them. The next day passed slowly. I cleaned rooms that were already clean. I moved objects from one place to another and back again. Not out of anxiety but preparation. I wanted the house to feel like mine when he walked in. At exactly 3, a car stopped outside. I watched from the window as he got out, his movements sharp, impatient. He didn't knock right away. For a moment, he simply stood there, as if gathering something he had forgotten to bring. When I opened the door, he looked surprised. Not by my presence but by my calm. You didn't answer me, he said. I did, I replied. I set terms. He stepped inside more slowly this time. His eyes met mine, searching for weakness. He wouldn't find it. What stood before him was not the mother who waited, but the woman who remained. We sat across from each other. No shouting. No pacing. Just distance measured in truth. I didn't mean it the way you took it, he began. I listened. Truly listened. But listening no longer meant surrender. Words, I had learned, are easy to adjust after consequences appear. When he finished, I spoke carefully. What you said showed me who I would be to you when I had nothing left to give. He frowned. That's not fair. I nodded. Life rarely is. Silence followed. Not heavy, not hostile. Honest. And for the first time, he understood something had shifted beyond his control. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms as if that might protect him from what he was hearing. I recognized the gesture. He had done it as a teenager whenever he felt cornered. Back then I softened. This time I didn't. You're overreacting, he said. You took one sentence and built a whole story around it. I looked at him for a long moment. No, I answered calmly. I listened to the sentence you meant. The one you didn't bother to soften. His jaw tightened. He wanted an argument. A chance to win. But this was not a fight. It was a reckoning. I have responsibilities, he continued. A wife. A life. You can't expect to come first. I never asked to come first, I said. I asked not to be discarded. That stopped him. Just for a second. I stood up and walked to the window, needing space to breathe. Outside, the street was quiet. Ordinary. Life moving on without noticing our small disaster. I realized how much comfort there was in that. When you told me not to expect care, I went on, I believed you. And I planned my life accordingly. He followed me with his eyes. So this is punishment. I shook my head. It's alignment. The word confused him. He didn't understand a choice that wasn't driven by anger. I loved you without conditions, I said. But I will not depend on someone who already explained his limits. He stood up abruptly. You're making a mistake. I turned to face him. No, I replied. I corrected one. For the first time he looked uncertain. Not guilty. Not apologetic. But unsure. The ground beneath him had shifted. And he hadn't noticed until now. He reached for his coat. Think about what you're doing, he said. I have, I answered. For a long time. When the door closed behind him, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory. Not relief. Acceptance. And acceptance, I was learning, is stronger than forgiveness when forgiveness is used to erase truth. After he left, I noticed how quiet my hands were. No trembling. No urge to chase after him with explanations I no longer believed in. That was new. Silence had finally stopped feeling like punishment. I sat back down at the table where we had spoken and touched the surface with my palm. This table had heard arguments, laughter, long meals that stretched into night. Today it had witnessed something rarer, final honesty. I made tea and let it cool while I thought. Not about him but about myself. About the years I had confused patience with love. Endurance with virtue. I wondered how many women my age were still waiting, still hoping that time alone would turn absence into care. In the afternoon I received another message. Short. Controlled. You're leaving me no choice. I read it once and deleted it. Choice I realized had always been his. He had simply disliked the moment when mine appeared. I went outside to the small garden behind the house. The soil was hard, winter not fully gone. I knelt carefully and pulled weeds that had survived the cold. Even neglected ground fights to live, I thought. So do people. As evening came, my body ached in familiar ways, but my mind felt clearer than it had in years. I wrote a list, not of fears but of boundaries. Who I would allow near me. What I would no longer explain. Where my energy would go. This was not bitterness. Bitterness looks backward. I was finally looking forward. When night fell, I locked the door and checked it twice. Not out of fear but out of care. For myself. For the life I still had. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of age, yes, but also the weight of relief. Some relationships do not end with shouting. They end with clarity. And clarity once found does not disappear. The following morning brought rain. Slow, steady, patient. It tapped against the windows as if reminding me that some things cannot be rushed. I welcomed the sound. Rain has always made the house feel protected, wrapped away from the world. I spent the day quietly. No phone calls. No messages. I half expected another confrontation, another attempt to pressure me into changing my mind. But none came. The silence felt different now, not tense, not threatening. Observant. In the afternoon, I found myself sorting through old photographs again. Not searching this time, just allowing memories to surface and pass. There were good years. I did not deny them. Love had existed. It simply had not grown in the same direction for both of us. That truth no longer crushed me. I cooked a proper meal for myself and set the table carefully, even though I was alone. Respect, I had learned, begins with small rituals. If no one else would honor my presence, I would. As evening approached, there was a knock. Not loud. Not demanding. Controlled. I opened the door slowly. He stood there again, but something was different. No anger. No sharp words waiting behind his teeth. Just restraint. "I didn't come to argue," he said. I studied him, weighing silence against response. Finally, I stepped aside and let him in. Not out of obligation, but because I was no longer afraid of the conversation. We sat in separate chairs, distance carefully maintained. He spoke about misunderstandings, about stress, about pressure from his life. I listened without interruption. Understanding does not require agreement. When he finished, I said only this: "I hear you. But hearing you does not undo what was said." He nodded slowly. That nod mattered more than his words. When he left, he did not slam the door. He closed it gently. I stood alone in the hallway, realizing something important. This story was no longer about him learning a lesson. It was about me keeping one. After that visit, something shifted in the air. Not peace. Peace is too generous a word, but balance. Like a scale that finally stopped swinging. I no longer checked my phone expecting anything. I no longer listened for his car outside. Detachment, I learned, is not coldness. It is rest. I began to notice my days again. The way morning light moved across the floor. The sound of my own footsteps. I started reading before bed, not to pass time but to inhabit it. Pages turned slowly without urgency. A letter arrived from the lawyer confirming everything in writing. Clear. Final. I placed it in the folder and closed the drawer. There would be no more revisiting, no more internal debates. Decisions deserve closure. Later that week, my knee gave out while I was reaching for a jar. I sat on the floor longer than I wanted to, breathing through the discomfort. When I stood up, I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, but because I had handled it myself. I always had. I arranged help for small things. Not from family, but from services, neighbors, systems designed for exactly this reason. Depending on structure felt safer than depending on promises. In the evening, I received a message from him. It was different this time. Short. Careful. "I understand your position." I read it once. I didn't reply. Understanding does not always require acknowledgement. Sometimes it requires space to prove itself. I went to bed early, listening to the house settle around me. Old homes make noise when they relax. So do people. I realized then that I was no longer waiting for change, from him or from myself. The change had already happened. What remained was maintenance, care, attention, the quiet work of living a life that finally belonged to me. Winter crept in slowly, unnoticed at first. Colder mornings, stiffer joints. I adjusted without complaint, layering sweaters, moving more carefully. There is a certain wisdom in not fighting what cannot be changed. One afternoon, I slipped on the steps outside. Not badly, but enough to remind me how fragile balance can be. I sat there for a moment, breath shallow, heart racing. No one saw. No one rushed to help. And yet I stood up on my own. Inside, I wrapped my hands around a warm cup and waited for the shaking to stop. Fear came late after safety. That is how it often works. I allowed it to pass through me without panic. That evening, he called. Not a message. A call. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was quieter than I remembered. He asked how I was. The question sounded rehearsed but sincere enough. "I'm managing," I said. And I was. He hesitated, then mentioned the fall. Someone had told him. Concern entered the conversation, tentative and unsure of its place. I didn't reject it. I also didn't lean into it. "I have help," I said. "Everything is arranged." There was a pause. Not awkward. Reflective. "I didn't realize," he began, then stopped. "I know," I replied gently. We spoke a few more minutes. Nothing heavy. Nothing unresolved. When the call ended, I felt neither relief nor disappointment. Just neutrality. That night I wrote in my notebook again. Not about pain but about strength. Quiet strength. The kind that doesn't announce itself. I had built a life that could hold me, even when others stepped back. And that, I realized, was something no one could take from me. Spring arrived without ceremony. One morning, I noticed a small green leaf pushing through the soil in the garden. I stood there longer than necessary, watching it move slightly in the wind, stubborn and alive. Growth, I thought, does not ask permission. My days became steadier. I learned my limits and respected them. I rested without guilt. I asked for help without apology. These were lessons I should have learned earlier, but learning them now still mattered. He began calling occasionally. Never long conversations. Just check-ins. Polite. Careful. I answered when I felt like it. When I didn't, I let the phone stay silent. Power does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like choice. One afternoon he asked if he could come by. Not demanded. Asked. I said no. Not forever. Not dramatically. Just no, not today. The word surprised both of us. I expected guilt to follow. It didn't. Instead, I felt calm. I had finally stopped measuring my worth by my availability. That evening I cooked a meal I loved, one he never liked. I ate slowly, enjoying every bite. Pleasure, I realized, had been postponed far too often in my life for the sake of harmony that never truly existed. Before bed, I opened the window and let fresh air fill the room. The house felt lighter. Not because it was empty, but because it was honest. I thought about the future. Not inheritance. Not conflict. Just days. Ordinary days with small decisions that belonged to me. If he remained in my life, it would be on new terms. If not, I would still be whole. Love, I finally understood, is not proven by how much you endure. It is proven by how well you protect yourself once endurance is no longer noble. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. Protection had once sounded selfish to me, almost cruel. Now it felt necessary, like locking the door at night, not to shut the world out but to sleep in peace. A few days later, I received a message from his wife. Polite. Careful. She asked how I was doing and suggested we meet sometime. I read it without resentment. She had always been respectful, distant but kind. Still, I did not answer right away. I asked myself an honest question. Was this about connection or damage control? I didn't judge the intention. I simply acknowledged my limits. I replied the next day. Short. Neutral. I'm well. Maybe another time. That was enough. In the afternoon, I sat on the bench in my garden and watched the sun move across the ground. My body hurt in familiar places, but the pain no longer frightened me. I knew its rhythm. I knew how to live with it. I thought about old age, not as something approaching but as something already here. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Manageable. Mine. That evening, I updated my notes once more. Emergency numbers. Preferences. Small details that matter when you stop assuming someone else will handle them. I felt oddly proud doing it. Responsibility, when chosen, feels different. Before bed, I looked around the house and noticed something new. I wasn't afraid of dying here anymore. I was afraid of losing myself, and that fear was gone. Whatever happened next, I would meet it standing. Not waiting to be rescued. Not hoping to be chosen. Simply present. Time softened the sharp edges of everything. Not by erasing them, but by making them familiar. Weeks passed, then months, and nothing dramatic happened. No arguments. No confrontations. Just distance finding its natural shape. One morning, I received a message from him asking if I needed anything. The question was simple, almost cautious. I read it and realized something surprising. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel gratitude either. I felt clarity. I'm fine, I wrote back. Thank you for asking. And I meant it. Later that day, I went through the house and noticed how much I had changed it without realizing. Furniture rearranged for comfort, not appearance. Objects placed where my hands could reach them easily. This space no longer waited for guests. It supported its owner. I had stopped explaining myself, to neighbors, to acquaintances, even in my own thoughts. Explanation is a habit formed when you expect resistance. I no longer did. In the afternoon, I felt tired and allowed myself to rest. I didn't push through it. I didn't prove anything. Rest, too, can be a form of self-respect. As evening came, I sat by the window and watched lights turn on in other houses. Lives unfolding separately, quietly. I wasn't excluded from them. I was simply living my own. I thought about him then, not with pain but with realism. If care came, it would be welcome. If it didn't, I was prepared. That balance felt like freedom. For years, I had believed security came from being needed. Now I understood something else. Security comes from knowing you will not abandon yourself, even when others do. One afternoon, a sudden storm cut the power. The house fell into darkness earlier than expected, the kind that makes every sound louder. I lit a candle and sat at the table, watching the flame steady itself. Even fire needs a moment to adjust. In the quiet, memories returned, not sharply but gently. Moments I hadn't judged before. Times I had ignored my own discomfort to keep peace. I saw them clearly now without anger. Understanding does not always demand forgiveness. Sometimes it only asks for honesty. When the power returned, I didn't rush to turn on every light. I left the room dim, comfortable. I liked knowing I could live with less brightness and still see. The next day, I received a small package in the mail. Inside was a scarf. No note. I recognized it immediately. It was my favorite color. A gesture, not an apology. An offering, not a conversation. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer. I didn't put it on. Acceptance does not require immediate closeness. Later, I walked to the corner store on my own. Slowly, deliberately. Each step felt earned. Independence, I had learned, is built from many small decisions repeated daily. That evening I made a phone call, not to him but to myself in a way. I scheduled something I had postponed for years. A short trip. Nothing far. Nothing dramatic. Just proof that my future still contained plans. As I went to bed, I realized something important. Reconciliation, if it ever came, would not be the center of my life. My life was already full, and anything added to it would have to fit gently, not replace what I had finally built. Preparing for the trip gave my days a new rhythm. Nothing rushed. Nothing overwhelming. I packed slowly, choosing comfort over appearance, practicality over habit. For years I had packed for others without thinking. Now every choice felt intentional. He found out about the trip through someone else. He called that evening, curiosity mixed with concern. "You didn't tell me," he said, not accusing, just surprised. "I didn't need to," I replied. There was a pause. Then a quiet acknowledgement. "I hope you enjoy it." So did I. While I was away, the nights felt different. Hotel walls are thinner, unfamiliar, but I slept well. I wasn't afraid of being alone in a strange place. I had learned that loneliness is not about location. It's about whether you feel erased. And I didn't. I walked slowly, rested often, allowed myself to be seen without explaining who I was to anyone. No one needed my history to treat me kindly. That realization felt liberating. When I returned home, the house welcomed me back like an old friend. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing missing. I stood in the doorway and smiled at the simplicity of it. A message waited on my phone. "Glad you're back," he had written. I didn't rush to respond. Not because I wanted distance, but because urgency no longer ruled my emotions. That night, I unpacked carefully, placing things back where they belonged. As I did, I understood something quietly but clearly. My life was no longer paused between his visits or his moods. It was moving forward steadily, gently, and on my own terms. The next morning, I woke with a sense of completion I hadn't felt before. Not an ending, something softer. Like a chapter settling into place. I moved through the house slowly, touching familiar objects as if greeting them again after a long absence. I answered his message later that day. Just 2 words. "Thank you." Nothing more was needed. In the afternoon, I sat at the table and reread my notebook. Page after page of thoughts, decisions, moments of fear and resolve. It surprised me how steady my handwriting had become. Pain had not made me smaller. It had made me precise. I thought about the will again, not with tension but with acceptance. It was no longer a symbol of conflict. It was simply a document that reflected reality as it was, not as I once wished it to be. That evening, I cooked dinner and set the table by the window. I ate slowly, watching the sky change color. I felt present in my body, aware of every ache, every breath. Aging no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like something I was participating in. For a brief moment, I wondered what the future would bring between us. More distance. Cautious closeness? I didn't chase the answer. Not knowing did not frighten me anymore. What mattered was this. I was no longer negotiating my worth. I was no longer preparing excuses for someone else's absence. When night came, I turned off the lights and stood in the dark hallway, listening to the house settle. Felt secure. Earned. Whatever tomorrow held, peace or difficulty, I would meet it as myself. Not hopeful. Not afraid. Simply whole. On the morning I realized the story had ended, Nothing unusual happened. No phone calls. No revelations. Just sunlight on the floor and the familiar sound of the kettle warming on the stove. Life continuing without asking for permission. I sat at the table and thought about everything that had changed and everything that hadn't. I was still old. Still alone in the ways that mattered. But I was no longer waiting to be chosen, forgiven, or remembered. He remained my son. That truth did not disappear. But it no longer defined my sense of safety or worth. Love had found a quieter place inside me. One that didn't ache or beg for proof. I went through the house and opened windows, letting fresh air move through rooms that had held so much silence. The walls did not judge. They simply stood as they always had. Later, I placed the notebook back in its drawer and closed it gently. Some stories are not meant to be reread. They are meant to be lived past. If someone asked me now whether I regretted my choice, I would answer honestly, no. Regret belongs to those who betray themselves to keep others comfortable. I had done the opposite. I had chosen dignity over expectation, peace over illusion, truth over habit. As evening came, I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed with a calm I had never known before. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was. Old age, I learned, is not about being taken care of. It is about knowing you can take care of yourself, even when love changes, even when people disappoint, even when the house grows quiet. And in that quiet, I finally felt at home.